Cardiff University. I'm going to be chairing this event today, which is about the Independent Commission on Referendums, which was established in October by our friends at the Constitution Unit at University College London. It's an independent commission reviewing the role of referendums in British democracy and considering how their rules and practice could be improved. We, of course, in Wales have significant experience of referendums ourselves in recent times, both UK-wide ones and ones specific to Wales. The Commission, in its membership, is a genuinely highly distinguished group of people. We're very lucky to have two of the members of the Commission with us today. And I'll just briefly, if I may, introduce them now. First of all, Sir Joe Pilling, who is chair of the Commission. Sir Joe has a very long, distinguished career in public life, having served as Director General of the Prison Service and for a number of years Permanent Secretary of Northern Ireland Office. He remains very active in public life as his role in chairing the Commission testifies. At the far end of the panel here is Dr. Alan Rennick, who is the Research Director for the Commission on Referendums. Alan is also Deputy Director of the Constitution Unit at University College London, and amongst his many very high quality academic publications, he's co-authored one of my favourite books, Faces on the Ballot, about the personalisation of electoral systems, published by Oxford University Press a couple of years ago. In addition to these two members of the Commission, we're also joined this morning by my friend and colleague at Cardiff University Wales Governance Centre, Professor Laura McAllister, who will be commenting on some of the aspects of the work of the Commission, possibly particularly as they are relevant to Wales. We were going to be joined this morning, the intention was for us to be joined by a third member of the Commission, Cheryl Gillan, who amongst her many distinctions is of course the past Secretary of State for Wales. Unfortunately, for compelling circumstances beyond her control, Cheryl has had to drop out of this event. She sent her apologies. This would have been better with her, but unfortunately she's unable to be here today. So the order is Joe is going to start off, speak first, then Alan will make a presentation, and then Laura makes some comments, and then we'll open it up for general discussion. So if I may, first of all, Sir Joe.
I'm going to carry on sitting. I hope that's okay. It makes very little difference, actually, whether I stand or sit. It comes to about the same height anyway. I feel least comfortable in Cardiff of the four sessions that we're doing. London, I've worked in most of my life. Belfast, I've worked in quite a lot of my life. For various reasons, both when I worked in the health field and in the criminal justice field, I had a lot of contact with Edinburgh. My only claim to any understanding at all of the business that gets settled in Cardiff is that the three of us in Edinburgh, Cardiff, Belfast, when I was the Permanent Secretary of the Northern Ireland Office, who had a common sense that London didn't really understand, used to meet privately and on the whole, without telling anybody we were meeting at regular intervals, and wept on each other's shoulders. So John Shortridge, who was then here, actually had to lean a long way down to reach my shoulder, but we did talk to each other a bit about our common problems. I'm just going to introduce how the unit came to set up the Commission. In its infancy, in the early mid-90s, the unit set up and supported a group on the conduct of referendums, and they reported in 1996. And their report didn't determine, but it certainly helped to shape the only UK legislation on referendums, which reached the statute book in 2000. Since 2000, we've had a lot more experience of referendums, as the chair mentioned, apart from the the referendum in Wales in 2011. There was the AV referendum that year across the whole UK, Scottish independence, of course, and Brexit. There's also been a big shift in campaigning since the 1990s, both in elections and referendums. And the unit judged that it was time for a fresh look at the whole subject. And it seemed worth aiming for a publication shaped by a cross-section of people representing relevant expertise and experience, and not necessarily starting off from the same perspective. So the Commission's been drawn together independent of government, party, and of the unit itself. Just to be clear, the unit's being very, very critically supportive of the whole enterprise, but there's nobody actually on the Commission that belongs to the unit. So the members of the Commission are independent, not only of government, but also of the unit. It's been asked to look at all aspects of the subject, from the broad brush to the relatively detailed. So the terms of reference invite us to look at what place referendums have in a representative democracy, what subjects and what circumstances call for a referendum, what can be said about when a referendum would be undesirable, and if we have a referendum, what should be its legal effect, given that we have got an unwritten constitution with a sovereign parliament. Is a simple majority appropriate in all cases? And the Commission's also considering a wide range of regulatory issues. Who should have the power to call a referendum? How should the government of the day behave before, during a referendum? We're looking at everything to do with campaign groups and their regulation. What can be done to make sure that the electorate can access accurate and relevant information in order to promote informed debate and decision-taking? I remain slightly amazed at UCL's success in assembling such a strong team. I was involved from a pretty early stage and would have known if lots of rather important people had turned down the chance to sacrifice part of their working life to this cause. And I don't recall anybody saying no, actually. There may have been one or two that I've forgotten. The team has insight into all four parts of the UK. We include a Labour Brexiteer who stood down at the 2017 election, Gisela Stewart, and Seema Malhotra, a Labour Remainer. Cheryl, of course, campaigned to leave, and Dominic Grieve didn't. Both held cabinet-level posts in the coalition. We have Andrew Wilson, who's an ex-MSP, who remains a senior figure in the SNP. Lord Eames, a crossbench peer, comes, of course, from Northern Ireland and brings the added bonus of knowing how referendums work in the Republic of Ireland, because he was the Archbishop of the Church of Ireland, which operates across all the counties of Ireland, north and south. And therefore he had as much interest in what went on in the Republic as what went on in the north. We have Jenny Watson, who chaired the Electoral Commission until 2016. Deborah Mattinson was actually a member of the first Referendums Commission that sat in the 1990s. She's our link with that group, and is a vastly experienced and still very active pollster. Academic expertise is provided by David Runciman from Cambridge and Martin Moore from King's College London. Martin is one of several members who know a great deal about social media, which is an important and tricky area. I'm not one of the several members who know about social media. But I think Martin is acknowledged by those that do to be even more focused in that area and the issues that it brings up. And my role is merely to help the 11 very lively minds that we've accumulated to hang together rather than hang separately. We're holding 8 meetings altogether, discussing material assembled by the team at the Constitution Unit. We've invited and received expert evidence. The aim is to publish a report before the summer break. The hope is that there will be continued public debate about the use of referendums and their regulation. Obviously not immediately after the report, because most people will be going on holiday, but beginning in the autumn and continuing after that. And our aspiration is that that debate will be better informed by the report that we hope to publish.
Thank you very much, Joe. So, Alan.
I shall move straight on. Many thanks, Joe, for that introduction, and thank you, Roger. Thank you to all of you for being here. The Commission sees it as very important that it should consult with people across the whole of the UK. So these events that we're holding in the 4 capitals of the UK are really important. So I'm looking forward very much to hearing your thoughts in a little bit. Joe introduced there the terms of reference of the Commission, and my task is to say a little bit more about what sorts of issues the Commission is looking at, what sorts of ideas it's exploring in order hopefully to stimulate your own thoughts on these subjects. So just to return to the terms of reference that Joe mentioned, these are the formal terms of reference that you'll also find on the Commission's website. So in the light of the 4 recent referendums, so that means the Welsh referendum of 2011, the alternative vote referendum a couple of months later, the Scottish independence referendum in 2014, and then the EU referendum in 2016. So in light of those, to consider the future political, legislative and administrative arrangements for the authorisation and conduct of referendums in the UK, including those 5 things that you can see on the screens behind. So the place that referendums should have in the UK's system of representative democracy, the legal effect of referendums and whether any additional constitutional safeguards are needed, the role of government during the campaign, the regulation of the designated lead campaign groups, and the provision of public information and education, and the promotion of informed debate. So what I'm going to do is simply run through those 5 areas and say a bit about what the Commission is considering in relation to each of them. So on the place of referendums, this is where we have the really fundamental question of what should be the place of referendums in the UK's democratic system. So in a sense, you could say that a referendum is a more democratic form of decision making than other processes, because it ensures that voters, the demos, can directly make the decisions themselves. But clearly democracy is not just about voting. It's also about discussing, about thinking about alternatives, thinking about options, exploring ideas. And referendums often are not terribly good at doing those other things. So it may be that in some ways, for some issues, representative democracy really is better for making decisions and more democratic for making decisions than referendums are. So thinking about exactly what are the circumstances in which it's appropriate to hold referendums, on what issues it might be more or less appropriate to hold referendums, how big a role we want referendums to play in the democratic system, how often we want referendums to take place within the democratic system. These are really important and big questions. And those questions lead on to a number of quite practical questions as well. So one is, how should it be possible to call a referendum? At present, Parliament is the only body that can call a referendum, the various parliaments are the only bodies that can call referendums at the large scale in the UK. Some would say that there ought to be a function for citizens so that they can directly initiate a referendum. Others, by contrast, would say that it should be harder to call a referendum, that referendums are such big issues, big events, that a simple parliamentary majority perhaps should not be enough. So there are arguments around whether it should be easier, whether it should be harder to call referendums. Then a further issue is whether we should think further about the processes that precede a decision to call a referendum in the first place. As I said, ideally, democracy isn't just about voting. It's also about thinking through the options and discussing and so on. And if these things don't happen by themselves very well within the context of a referendum campaign, then perhaps we should be thinking about, well, what are the steps that we need to go through before we get to the stage of actually calling a referendum to work out what are the options that should be on the ballot paper, what actually are the issues that people care about that ought to be put to a referendum vote. Can we develop procedures to ensure that it's clear what the options on the ballot paper actually mean, and what they would do, what they would lead to a greater degree than sometimes has been the case in the past. Of course, here in Wales we have an example of a referendum from 2011 that was preceded by the Richard Commission, on which Laura sat, which did a great deal of thinking through these issues. But sometimes that hasn't been the case. So thinking through these processes is important. And then a third question within this area concerns what should be done when a referendum might be needed on a broad principle rather than on specific change. So on one hand, the issues that often are put to referendums are often the really big issues around, most fundamentally, who are the people? What should the boundaries of the political community be? So the Scottish independence referendum is clearly a classic example of that. But such a broad question it isn't a question on a specific proposal that has already been laid down in law. So it can be quite difficult for voters to see exactly what are the implications of voting for the change. But if we think that in a referendum it should be as clear as possible to voters what it is that they are voting for or against, then that can be a problem. So what should we do in these situations where there seem to be strong arguments for having a referendum on a broad principle, but just having a referendum on a broad principle may mean that it's difficult for voters to keep control over the process because they're voting on something before the detail has really been worked out. So those are some of the really big and difficult questions that come out under that first heading in the terms of reference. There are, of course, others, but I'm not going to try to cover all of the ground here. The second of the items on the terms of reference concerns the legal effect of referendums. And as Joe was hinting in his opening remarks, though, one of the issues under this heading is whether the result of a referendum should be binding or simply advisory. And in a sense, that's quite a difficult issue to deal with within the UK's constitutional framework because Parliament is always sovereign. Parliament cannot be bound ultimately. So it's not clear that one can achieve more than kind of political bindingness for decisions in a referendum. But that's certainly one issue to consider. And then a further issue, and one that the Commission has been giving quite a lot of attention to, is the issue of whether there should be thresholds beyond the simple 50% plus one rule in referendums, or other safeguards beyond that rule. So if referendums are deciding really, really fundamental issues, many people think that it's not appropriate that a simple majority, perhaps on very low turnout, can lead to big change. And of course, these issues are particularly salient in Wales. So the 1997 referendum, you know this better than I do, was famously tight. If I remember, it was 50.3% voted for the creation of this institution on a turnout of 50.2%. Is that right? 50.1. So that's quite tight. And then the 2011 referendum is, of all the referendums, the large-scale referendums in the UK, the one that saw the lowest turnout, on 36, 37, something like that. Yeah, percent of the vote. So, so the introduction of further thresholds would have had clearly particular implications for those referendums. So I'd be really interested to hear perspectives from Wales on these issues. If we were to consider additional thresholds beyond the basic 50% plus one rule, then there's a question of what form they should take. So there could be a supermajority threshold. So you require more than 50%, you require 60% or 55% or whatever it might be. It could be that you require a certain level of turnout. Or that you require a certain proportion of the electorate as a whole, the eligible electorate, to vote for the proposal, as was the case in the 1979 referendums on devolution. One proposal that was put by the Scottish National Party particularly, I don't know if it was put in Wales actually, you'll know that, was the proposal in the 2016 referendum that there should be separate majorities in Scotland, Wales, England and Northern Ireland before change would go through. So that's the multiple national thresholds that you see there. And there are also ideas around perhaps you should say that there should be a double referendum process, that if you get a very narrow result then you should have a little cooling off period and then have a further referendum in order to consider whether that is really there is really a stable majority for the change. But the Commission is also aware that there are really good arguments against having these kinds of provisions. If you have a majority, even a small majority, for a change, and then you block it, then what does that do to opinion among the majorities? To take the example of the EU referendum, 52% voted for the change. Had we said no, we're not getting that, we're going to ignore that, then that could well have led to problems. And quite legitimate problems, many would say. So there are many arguments against having additional thresholds. And if you don't have those additional thresholds, then what other forms of safeguard can you put in place to ensure that the process as a whole of the referendum does reflect a kind of considered, settled will of voters? And here we might think of, again, the sorts of pre-referendum processes that I was mentioning earlier, and I'll come back to, around processes of thinking and deliberation about the issues and the options before you actually get to the referendum stage. Third on the agenda is the role of government within the referendum process. So here the fundamental question is, should governments be able to promote their own viewpoint in a referendum? So governments as state organs. So clearly the politicians who form a government are campaigners and are always welcome to put their arguments, but should the state as such be able to put its resources behind promoting its own viewpoint in a referendum? Some would say yes, the government has been elected by voters and it has a particular place in the process. Others would say no, if you're putting a question to voters, then you're devolving that responsibility to them, and the government should from that point step aside. So there's that question of principle. And then and I think most people think that governments should step aside and should not promote their own viewpoint in referendums. If that's the case, then how should governments be restrained? As some of you will be aware, under the current referendum legislation in the UK, there is provision that bars government from using the resources of the state in the final 4 weeks of a referendum campaign. But in practice, the campaign gets going well before that. So in practice, governments have been able to do quite a lot of campaigning before that. And many people would say that that period should be extended. Another concern is that although we have this rule, there's no process of monitoring it at the moment. So should that be changed? And should there be penalties for non-compliance in order to ensure that really government does adhere to this principle. There was again particular concern around this in the EU referendum, where the government spent millions of pounds on a leaflet that went out just before the 4-week period arguing for Remain, and many people would say that was an unfair intervention. It clearly didn't work, but in principle it was an unfair intervention. I'm losing count. I think this is number 4 I'm on to now, which is on the role of the designated lead campaigners. So one of the key parts of referendum legislation in the UK is that we have a designated lead campaigner for each side of the debate that is designated by the Electoral Commission, and it receives some funding from the state, extra benefits, and also it has higher spending limits than other campaign groups. So is it desirable to have designated lead campaigners? The argument in favour of this is essentially that it ensures that the voice of both sides can be properly heard, that one side is not severely disadvantaged in the debate. But there are some concerns that if you're turning the debate really into a competition between two camps, then you're polarising, and you increase the polarising effect that you already get from a binary choice in a referendum, and you're suppressing the plurality of opinion. Again, this is a question where Welsh evidence will be particularly interesting, because the Welsh referendum in 2011 was one that did not have designated lead campaigners, because there was no applicant deemed to meet the requirements on the no side in that referendum. So I'll be really interested to hear how that works.
Not correct.
Okay, fine. I look forward. So that's one broad issue. If it is desirable to have lead campaigners, is it desirable to have just one on each side? Would there be merit in allowing greater plurality in the system? Does the designation process need to be reformed? So one concern, again, in the EU referendum in particular, the EU referendum was the first time when there were two campaign groups that were deemed to meet the statutory test that applied for one side of the debate. So two groups campaigned to be the lead campaigner on the Leave side in that referendum, which meant that the Remain side, the Remain campaign, knew that they were going to get the designation well in advance. They could prepare, they could organise and so on, whereas on the Leave side it was harder to do that, which may have disadvantaged the Leave side. So should there be reforms in that process? And finally, if we're designating lead campaigners and giving them all these benefits, should they also have additional responsibilities and additional duties? Should there be further requirements on how they use the state resources, for example? Then final area is the area around information and debate during the referendum campaign. And this is something that I know many people have been concerned about in several recent referendums, and these concerns cut across the division between the yes and no sides in those referendums. So are there better ways to promote better quality information, better quality debate during referendum campaigns? And I think there are basically 3 approaches to trying to do that have been talked about quite a lot. One is that some people have suggested, well, if people are making false and misleading claims during referendums, then you should simply ban that. You should stop people from making false and misleading claims. And, you know, on the surface that looks very attractive, but there are also big problems with trying to do it and with doing it effectively. If you really want to make it work, then you have to ban not just blatantly false claims, but also those that are on the surface are true but are misleading. But that would clearly cause enormous concerns about free speech and meddling and so on. So you can't go there. But if you don't do that, and if you only restrict blatantly false statements, then you're not doing very much, and you're not really limiting very much, and potentially you're making matters worse, because you're kind of giving a stamp of approval to things that are said that actually are quite misleading. So that may be quite a problematic approach. A second approach is to try to run a more detailed public information campaign than is done at present. So at present, the Electoral Commission gives very limited information about the options in referendums. In some countries, electoral commissions or other bodies give much more detailed information on the options in advance of referendums. And that works well in some places, but whether it would work well in the UK is a difficult issue. We do have a particularly combative political environment, media environment in the UK, and it may be difficult for a body providing such information to do so in a way that is both interesting and relevant, but not perceived as being or portrayed as being biased in one way or another by campaigners. And then the third approach is to try to get more public deliberation into processes of referendums. So I mentioned before the possibility of having deliberation taking place before you even call a referendum. And Ireland is a good example of this, where they're about to have a referendum on abortion and whether to liberalise abortion rules. And that follows a process of careful deliberation by a citizens' assembly that took place last year in order to look into the issues. And it's also possible to think about how you can inject deliberative processes into referendum campaigns themselves in order to get people to give people an opportunity to hear the arguments, reflect on the arguments, hear from other people. So these are also ideas that are worth considering. And just one very final point before I stop. Since the Commission was set up, there has been a lot of talk about online campaigning and difficulties with online campaigning. And the question of whether any specific changes could be made in this area is also one that the Commission is considering. So the Electoral Commission and a number of other bodies have made some proposals, particularly that online advertising should be subject to the same imprint rules as other advertising, so it should be clear who is doing the advertising. Another idea is that advertising, political advertising online should go into some kind of repository where everyone can access it and see what advertising is being put out by campaign groups. The concern at the moment is that different messages are being put out to different people, are being micro-targeted on different people online. And it's impossible for the rest of us to know what is being said, which raises issues of accountability. So perhaps that could be changed and they should be required to make that transparent. And some people are suggesting we should go even further. I just noticed on the news this morning I call for a moratorium on all micro-targeted political advertising online until we sort out these issues. So there's potential for some quite radical change in this area, I think. Okay, I think that's enough from me. I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Alan. Now for some comments and views from Laura.
Okay, diolch yn fawr iawn, Roger, thank you. I mean, I thought I'd try and add some comments in response to those introductory remarks from Joe and Alan, particularly in relation to recent experiences in Wales. 3 points. First of all, it seems to me that referendums here in Wales have happened where there's been division or controversy or a desire to draw a line under a matter. And these are not always political in a strict sense of political. They've often been party political. I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. In our experience, in our recent experience in Wales, referendums have been largely party political devices. Back in 1979, obviously in a post-legislative context, then in 1997 in a pre-legislative context. Those ones obviously have been driven by the Labour Party, unsurprisingly, given Labour hegemony in terms of status in Wales. And that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because if you look at the theory around referendums, the left generally has been less enthusiastic about referendums, seeing them as a kind of block to radical reform and a way of not allowing radical reform to take place. But of course we mustn't forget that the Conservatives have also been involved in some of the calls for referendum. The original draft Wales bill included a clause for a referendum on income tax varying powers, which of course was then lost in the next legislation. So they've been very selectively used and often due to party political imperatives. the 2011 referendum, which is obviously the one that you're looking at probably in most detail because it's most recent since the legislation on referendums, is a really odd one, and in many respects, and I think Roger said this in his book on this, it's a case study in how not to do a referendum. First of all, it was on a hugely technical matter, a move to full primary legislative powers, and moving away from the legislative competence order system. Very, very technical, but of course a relatively low salience issue in the public mind, not a point of principle in any way, more a point of technical move, and hugely party political in terms of when it happened, because it was a referendum clause in a piece of legislation that was triggered because of a deal between Labour and Plaid Cymru in the One Wales coalition agreement. So it happened then because of a party political deal. So I think that kind of underlines some of the points that we've mentioned a moment ago. Alan, you talked about the turnout in that referendum, which was 35.5% or 35.6%, I think. Roger will correct me. Actually, that's quite impressive, isn't it, given what this referendum was about and the degree of understanding that one needed to actually be motivated to go out and vote. So actually, I think that kind of turnout isn't a bad one, given the salience of the issue. Overwhelmingly in favour of changing the system, as we know, 64% of those who voted in favour of changing that system. But I'll come on to this in a second. What a difficult and almost impossible issue to engender any kind of serious political debate on amongst the public, because it is highly technical. And if we're talking about referendums as being, should referendums be held on points of principle, it's hard to really see where the point of principle here was, because it was contained in previous legislation. I think that's quite an important point. One point I will make, because Alan was a member of the expert panel that worked on the size of the Assembly and the electoral system that I chaired, and Alan was a member of before Christmas. And if you followed the social media on this, and I know some of you have, because I've engaged with you on it, there has been some debate about whether the proposals to increase the size of this institution and change the electoral system should be subject to a referendum, or whether that is something that should simply be a mandate achieved through an election manifesto. There's lots of us who argue it should be neither, but it's interesting that there has been some social media commentary on the relevance of that at the moment. The final point I'll make is about public information and education, because that seemed to me to be the most compelling and interesting for all of us that came out of your presentation, Alan and Joe. If you think about the 2011 referendum, we've just said how technical and detailed the matter under consideration was there. But in many respects, so too was the 2016 European Union referendum in terms of its reach and relevance. And in all of the referendums we've had in Wales, they've been fairly late decisions about holding them. I mean, all the way back to 1997, if you remember, there was not meant to be a referendum on Scottish and Welsh devolution. It was meant to be the mandate of the 1997 general election. And then because Tony Blair felt, I mean, this is how we've all analysed the evidence on this, because Blair felt that this would wrong foot the Conservatives in terms of their attacks on a potential breakup of the Union in Scotland. There needed to be a referendum in Scotland. I suspect, and Leighton Andrews talks about this in his book, by the way, that they probably thought there's no need to have one in Wales because it's a very limited form of devolution. But Ron Davies felt there's no way we can have a referendum in Scotland without a referendum in Wales. But of course, that was a late addition to the debate. Now, that does have implications, doesn't it, about your notion of a staged approach to public deliberation. And if there isn't time, then what we go into is straight away into a kind of binary environment where the arguments are necessarily oversimplified in terms of what is put before the electorate. I find your arguments are very compelling about greater public deliberation, citizens' assemblies and so on, but I suspect the party political dimension to referendums will make that extremely difficult to implement in practice. And I think, there'll be different opinions to this, but I think when we look at the EU referendum and why people voted in the way they did, both Remain and Leave, by the way, I think if we drill down, there will be a multitude of reasons, not all of which are actually directly relevant to the decision that was in front of people. When you've got a very weak media, as we have in Wales, particularly a Welsh-focused weak media, it's extremely difficult to tease out any of those issues unless we think of alternative routes. So I'd be interested to know what you think those are. And then finally, you know, aside from the very constitutional points about whether a direct or an indirect democracy is right and proper, you know, we know what we have. You know, we have a system of parliamentary sovereignty and an indirect democracy. However, when we go to the public in referendums, we are actually involving them much more directly. I wonder what the public's attitude to that is, and Roger's the opinion expert here, but I wonder what the public's attitude is, because in my conversations with people post-EU referendum, and to a degree in the 2011 referendum, people actually said, you know, when there are issues of such incredible import and detail and complexity, I'm not always sure that I want to be asked as a citizen about this topic. Now, there's lots of ways of seeing this, and I appreciate people who have different perspectives, but I think we've got to be careful to assume that in those spaces between direct and indirect democracy, that it's always a good thing to ask citizens. I think citizens themselves don't want to be asked about some issues. And I'll stop there.